Hello and welcome to an aviation podcast hosted by 270 Aviation. With offices across the globe, our team of consultants discuss the latest developments across the aviation industry and share the insights they've gained working alongside some of the world's major airports and airlines over the past 20 years. So whether you're a seasoned professional or a budding aviation enthusiast, take a moment to sit back, plug your earphones in and join us over a warm cup of coffee.
Welcome to part 2 of our episode on urban air mobility. In part 1, the team laid the groundwork for what the UAM landscape will look like, and in this second installment, our specialists explore the issues of safety and commercial viability of the industry. Over to your host. So we've spoken about noise and the implications that urban air mobility can have in that space. Another aspect, if we talk about safety, is risk management or risk modeling. We talked about noise modeling earlier, but in the Netherlands, there's a concept, and the UK, there's a concept called public safety areas. These are designated areas of land at the end of runway thresholds where land planning policy exists, where you have restrictions on what you can and can't build based on the likelihood of a crash in these areas. Now, Australia currently doesn't have a mandated public safety area policy for its airfields or airports, but in the future, I'd imagine a similar concept will come about, and I'm interested to know how urban air mobility fits in terms of risk and safety.
I think that the design of the vertiports, just like the design of helicopter landing sites today, will need to consider those areas on the approach to and into the departure paths from the landing sites and make an assessment of the risk to those people who live underneath the proposed flight paths. We know that the critical times of any aircraft flight are takeoff and landing. So what form that assessment will take, I'm not really sure. I certainly know that in the drone world, there's a lot of work being done to examine those risks associated with collisions with the ground, and there's a large volume of work that you can read on that subject. So that's just one risk that needs to be assessed, and you expect that it would become part of the process for establishing any new vertiport or landing site associated with urban air mobility.
It would be incorporated into the planning approval process, I would imagine.
Yes, it would. Just as your noise study would, you would need to demonstrate that you have considered the impacts of noise and annoyance on the community in the selection of your air routes, the location of your vertiports and the flight paths to and from the vertiports. All those usual processes that I've gone through today with the establishment of a helicopter landing site, you would expect to apply to a vertiport. Essentially, if you think about the size of these vehicles, if you're going to carry 4 people and their luggage, the vehicle has to be the same size as a helicopter that can do that task, like a Jet Ranger or similar. So they are going to be a fair size, these vehicles. They are not going to be small single-person vehicles, though those may exist. They're going to be a fair size, and the propellers or rotors that drive them will have similarly large diameter to create the lift required. Therefore, I would expect them to have a similar footprint of a helicopter today that does the same task.
Yes, and I think there's also an element involved in terms of how these things are operated. So in order to maximize their, utility and efficiency and economic value, it would be better if they were remotely piloted. So whether or not that is a remote pilot sitting in a building or a vehicle nearby, or are we going to start moving towards the vehicles flying themselves autonomously? And I think what that means is that over time, as we build these rules and regulations and safety risk management approaches, there's going to be elements of things we don't know. And it's it's the unknown unknowns, as I think Donald Rumsfeld once phrased it. And I think these areas will present some risk, because one of the differences, if you like, between these types of vehicles and established aviation vehicles is I think they're going to be a lot closer to the ground. So in terms of trying to recover from a maneuver which results in a sudden loss of altitude, I think the margins are going to be a lot smaller.
Definitely. So Phil, you touched on it earlier in terms of urban air mobility competing with existing mass transport systems. So the technology comes into place, the infrastructure comes into place, all the approval process and risk modeling, noise modeling has been done. How feasible is urban air mobility commercially?
Well, I think that as far as trying to compete with mass transport, you just can't do that. You can't. A Melbourne tram can hold 220 people. I don't think you're going to be having any kind of urban air mobility buses in the sky. That would be a very interesting concept.
Yeah, it's called a plane.
But I think that if you then think about the concept of competing with, say, an Uber driver on the ground in a vehicle, so you want to try and compete in that market of being an on-call service where someone uses an app to book the service and it turns up and flies you away. So, I mean, the setup cost, you think, for an Uber driver, they've got to buy a vehicle and they've got to have a driver's license, and there's a few other things they have to pay for. But essentially, for $50,000, you're up and running. To purchase one of these new vehicles, I would expect, even when they're in mass production, it's probably going to be the $1 million plus kind of investment to get one. And I read, I think Uber estimated that it'll be about $700 an hour to operate one of these vehicles, in the right circumstances. So the actual setup cost and cost of operating these vehicles compared to a taxi is quite significant. And the other, I suppose, the advantage of a taxi is that you can hail it. It comes to the roadside where you're stood. It picks you up, and it drops you at the front door of your destination, pretty much. Whereas with an urban air mobility vehicle, you'd have to actually go to a vertiport. I can't see these things landing in Burke Street and picking people up. Certainly not in the first instance.
They could.
So you have to trap.
I'd say they could hover above you and drop a rope ladder down.
That should be interesting. So you have to go to a vertiport to access your vehicle, and then you have to get off at the vertiport closest to your destination, unless the vertiport, of course, is at your destination. So there's I suppose it's going to be difficult to compete with a ground journey, certainly if it's only over a few kilometres, because the Uber taxi is probably going to get you there quicker. But I think the further apart the origin and destination are, the more attractive it becomes. Certainly, if you think about these vehicles being used in the first instance more as an adventure or being part of a tourism activity, where the actual vertiports at the origin and at the destination are actually where you want to be, so you haven't got to travel on from those points. So, for instance, if I was coming into Melbourne on a cruise ship, for instance, if there was a vertiport at the cruise ship terminal that could offer me an experience to fly to a winery, for instance, or even to go to the MCG or to the Melbourne Zoo, wherever that might be, or even go to Chadstone Shopping Centre, if that's what I wanted to do. If the destination was actually part of the adventure and you didn't have to go on from there, I think it becomes quite realistic to compete with the ground transport options, because it is an adventure and it's part of a package of that's something you would do. And I think from those beginnings, it can then become a more common form of transport. And if you arrive at Melbourne Airport, you may choose to take an urban air mobility vehicle into the city rather than get a taxi. I expect that the journey times will be similar, but you wouldn't, because of getting to the vertiport at the airport, and I expect there'll still be security checks, and that you can't just wander onto a vertiport surface to get into a vehicle. You need the safety aspects of actually accessing the vehicles. Now, that's
an interesting one for me as well, where aviation security is concerned. Right now, your typical plane journey involves an extensive, screening process of passing through security. Yes, in this case, the number of passengers in a particular vehicle could be up to 4 people. But do you see this more as, if we, staying with the comparison of a taxi journey versus a drone taxi journey, is it as simple as just walking in, booking your drone and just stepping on, or do you have to go through a pre-boarding security, a similar process to the current plane journey?
All right, I think that security will be an important part of certainly. If there's a pilot on board, maybe that pilot's isolated from the passengers, so they can't interfere. But if there's no pilot, how do you stop the people in the vehicle trying to do something that they shouldn't? And if you go to a vertiport and you've come from the pub and you've got your doner kebab in your hand and you're looking to get home, maybe you could have hailed a taxi and done that, but maybe you can't do that when you're using an urban air mobility vehicle. There may be some constraints on that type of activity. So I think security will be an issue, and certainly will be a concern for those people who operate the vehicles, and also the people who live in the vicinity of those vertiports.
So Rob, do you see it more as, if you try to visualize the journey, do you see it more as going to the coach station to catch a coach, or do you see it as more equivalent to a domestic plane journey?
I don't think it's really going to compare closely to either of those things. I think Phil's sort of hit it on the head in terms of the initial usage we'll see will be much along the novelty lines. Very much the same way that it was for the...
So it'll be a dedicated service akin to a private helicopter tour?
Initially, I think so, because that will help the operators control their costs and build their procedures. I think you'll start to see, very similar to the early aircraft and early trains. People didn't go on them to travel anywhere. They went on them to ride on the particular contraption that they were inside. That was the aim of the exercise, was to actually get onto the transport and use it. And I think there will be an element of that initially. I think one area that maybe hasn't been explored very well yet is that this will probably lead, especially in our famed early adopter cohort, for people wanting to start obtaining these vehicles for themselves. So there seems to be a lot of talk at the moment about general public use of these type of vehicles. There doesn't seem to be a lot of effort or a lot of focus on private use, people purchasing vehicles and using them themselves, and how would these integrate into the overall picture. But I think that will be one of the major sort of next developments in this, after sort of widespread tourism or novelty-based use.
And we talk a lot. We always talk about urban air mobility. And it's a form of transport to take you around a city where there's congestion. But no one's talking about rural air mobility or suburban air mobility, where these vehicles support rural or regional operations. There's the distance between towns and facilities in regional areas can be quite great. I can't see any reason why these types of vehicles couldn't operate in a regional environment, and probably it might even be easier because there's less congestion, there's less demand. But I don't see why.
This is where the price point will come into play, If I'm thinking about a 3-hour journey into rural Victoria, how much would that train ticket cost, Phil? In what ballpark are we talking?
Oh gosh, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. I know, but $100 maybe.
Yeah, so that's going to be the if it comes down to cost, would the equivalent journey in a urban air mobility vehicle cost less for that user? Or will conventional transport means such as a train or a coach still be better value for money?
Well, again, for mass transport, it probably is. But I mean, if you're going from a regional somewhere north of Melbourne, say to Melbourne Airport to catch a flight, there's not a lot of public transport options available to you. I mean, if you had access to an urban air mobility or a rural air mobility vehicle, then it might be something that's attractive for regional centres to have those kinds of vehicles based, and they have the space to actually park them, to service them. Now, these vehicles have to go somewhere at the end of the day, and I'm assuming that when they start, it'll be daytime VMC, daytime good weather operations. Now, these vehicles have to go somewhere to be parked and to be maintained, just like any other flying vehicle does. So there may be opportunities for places close to cities to support the servicing and maintenance of these vehicles. If it's only a 20-minute flight away, then that's something that could be an option. And people are talking about these vehicles doing 300 kilometres an hour. So actually they can get along the same sort of speeds as helicopters do today.
I mean, that's going to create a whole new industry in urban air mobility engineers and people who basically maintain and fix these vehicles at the moment.
Absolutely.
Because presumably they're going to have to be qualified and registered and certified to do that. You can fancy my local mechanic.
Well, that's how there's opportunities there for people who have land or doing developments close to the city, but not in the city, to actually set up a business doing that. As part of a sustainability project, it could be something that a regional area or somewhere in the suburbs of the city could quite realistically do. There's opportunities to actually establish yourself as an urban air mobility service centre, and you think it would be good for jobs. I mean, I definitely think these things are going to be in the environment in the next 10 years. It just needs some brave soul to start that journey.
Can I just put a question to both you gents, just to take the temperature, if you like? Once these things become available, would you use them? Would you fly on a unmanned aerial vehicle to?
Not personally. Cost would be certainly a factor for me, even for a novelty ride. And then in terms of safety, I think I would ride it after a few years.
Not an early adopter then?
Not an early adopter, no, sadly. Phil?
I think I might be a little bit more adventurous than you, Anu. I think I would love to flying one of these vehicles, whether it had a pilot or not. I think it'd be a great experience, and it would be nice to think that maybe you've been part of that journey in helping it happen through the work that you've done, working with the aviation industry and other participants in this exciting new venture. So I would definitely be a person queuing up to get on one of these things in the early days, just to say that I've done it.
And Rob, yourself?
It's almost in line with Phil. I think if we had the opportunity as an organisation to work on a project related to this, I'd love to take part in that. If one of our competitors did it, I might be a bit more nervous.
Excellent stuff. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time this week. Phil, where can people find you?
They can find me on LinkedIn, Anu, and just Google Phil Owen, and you should be able to find me there.
Rob, yourself?
I am pretty much in the same location. So yes, Rob Morris at 270 on LinkedIn.
Excellent stuff. And if you want to get in touch with us regarding the podcast today, feel free to comment on the post on LinkedIn or email us at info@to70.com.au. Until next time, stay safe.
Thank you for listening. To contact any of the hosts from this episode, please go to the links in the post description. For more info regarding the topics discussed in today's show, please visit our website, www.to70.com, where you can also access all our published industry articles in our blog section. To provide feedback on today's show or to simply inquire about our services, please contact us at info@to70.com.au. Until next time, safe travels.